So they're coming in pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a floodgate.
Yeah.
Do you have any special process that you'd use to get revved up for July 22nd?
Yeah. It's just, it's funny. I had a client tell me that this is the end of my schedule. Basically, my summer's over. And with all the football teams starting and everything, and it's like, so Friday is basically it, and then both teams start up next week. So they're like, you need to take time off, and I'm like, well, I'm trying to get everything done prior to it because it's over. And they're like, I'm like, yeah, why didn't I take time off?
You guys didn't take a vacation, summer vacation or anything?
No, we did everything in the spring. Typically the spring is the best time for all that. And then like right now, Colorado weather is perfect now. And so why leave when it's the best weather here during the spring and summer and winter? That's when the bad months are here. So we always take a few trips in the March, April time period.
So for those of you that have just come on, it's not quite the top of the hour yet. We'll probably start in about 3-4 minutes, just to give the other people time to get in. A lot of people don't actually show up until the top of the hour. There's numerous people registered for this, so there may be a couple hundred that are going to be showing up on the live presentation. So we just want to give them a few minutes so everyone get on at the same time and hear everything. So if you need to powder your nose or get something to drink, feel free. If you're gonna get some popcorn, go for it. And then we'll be starting here shortly. Just check one more now. We've got a pretty good representation from the European market.
That's what you're saying. Yeah.
South American. Looking through some of the names and even some of the email addresses, you can see a little bit where they're from.
Oh, so you can see all that?
Yeah, on the attendees, do you have an attendees drop down?
Oh, it drops down. Okay.
And then it'll say attendees and the staff. You and I are the staff.
Yeah, mine just shows me and you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm the organizer, so I can see all of those.
Right.
So as you are coming into this webinar right now, you'll hear Greg and I talk just because we don't want to be on mute and sit there and chit chat a little bit. We'll start in about probably 2 more minutes because we have a number of people that were registered. And so I want to make sure everyone's able to get onto the live presentations as we start, just so nobody misses anything. So feel free to take a minute or two if you need to get something, grab something, go to the restroom, whatever you may need to do.
Did you go to IDEA?
No, I did not. I did submit for next year with some of the things that we have with our online education. Now that we actually have some online education, that makes it easy to go and actually have a takeaway for people.
Mhm.
Life workshop's a little harder to sell it.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll wait about 1 more minute. And then we'll get started. All right. All right, so for sake of time, we'll go ahead and get started now. I know there'll be some people trickling in. We'll just do some quick introduction and some housekeeping. First and foremost, welcome everyone to this particular Eleiko Strength Talk. I am personally super excited. I get to spend some time with a longtime colleague and what I consider a good friend. We've had many conversations, much time together, spent many time. I've had the pleasure of learning from him, being worked on by him, and we've actually taught some stuff together, so it's been awesome. Before we get into what's going to happen today, real quick, you'll all be muted and you won't have a camera. That's just to eliminate chaos and sounds and different things can happen that interferes with your learning experience. So just know that you do have a control panel. That control panel will be used today. There are different tabs. You'll see that there's a chat tab. In that chat tab later on, we will upload some links that you'll be able to access information about what we're talking about and what Greg will be going through. We also have a handout tab. In that handout tab, there's already a handout downloaded that you can access right now, and that has links, the links that we will be uplinking or uploading into the chat tab. So you'll have that in 2 different forms, one to take away, one that's here right now. And then as we go through this, we do welcome the questions. So please feel free, if you have questions, to number 1, remember what they are, and 2, you can ask them. But what Greg and I will do was reserve the right to answer them at the end, unless they're specifically pertinent to what we're talking about at that particular moment and they drop in and we can see them. So just know that we would like to be able to answer questions. We just don't want to interrupt the flow of the presentation too much, because Greg will probably get on a roll, and I want to let him talk as much as possible. I'll try to minimize how much chit chat I do and let him do the work. And that said, just know that when you submit a question, there will be a little bit of a delay before it actually shows up where I can see it. So just know that. All right, so for everyone that's on, excuse me, for everyone that's on right now, I just want to really quick introduce Greg Roskopf to you. As I mentioned, Greg and I we go back probably almost 25 years now, and it's been a pleasure knowing him. Greg is the founder, developer, and kind of the whole chief of the muscle activation technique, which is known as MAT, which stands for muscle activation techniques. He's worked with numerous people, probably thousands over the last couple of decades. And they range all the way from the elite professional athletes. You can see 2 of them behind him. He does a lot of stuff with the Denver Broncos. He does a lot of stuff with other professional American football teams as well. He'll be doing some stuff in San Francisco with 49ers, see if they can get back on track. And that's because I live in Northern California. I'm not biased, but that just, it is. So the other thing that Greg has done is he's worked with basketball players, baseball players from professional levels, strongmen. He's worked with many bodybuilders, which is interesting. And he was a former college football player who then suffered an injury, not in football, but he suffered an injury at a job he had when he was younger, suffered a compression fracture of his L5 vertebrae. And between that, which kind of ended his career for the most part, it forego his last year, I think, Greg, forego your last year of playing. But between what he experienced as residual effects from that and then what he saw as a strength and conditioning coach. So he went on to be a strength and conditioning coach at Fresno State, which is just a few hours from where I live. And what he saw in that and what he was going through personally kind of led him on his journey to find better ways to address the tightness issue, the flexibility issue, the maintaining of strength over prolonged periods of time. And that's when he got into understanding and working with some people at a much higher level. And by the way, everything I'm telling you about, you can read in detail in his book. So he has a book out. There will be a link up that you can talk about. And it's all in there. But essentially, it led him to understand and get involved with muscle testing. And what Greg did is he took the muscle testing that we typically kind of see, but he modified it very specifically, and that he can talk about later on, that really addresses the functionality and the activation of the muscle tissue, which he then found that correlation between the weakness in muscles was leading to the tightness in other muscles. And that's where this whole process has started. And so that's what we're kind of in for today. This is how we're going to talk about how this particular information that Greg has really honed in on, mastered, developed, practiced, and he's utilized over the last couple of decades. And I just want to say something about Greg as a third-party validation. So I've known him for about 25 years. I've seen him at multiple conferences. I remember Greg, I don't know if you remember, but being at the Meeting of the Minds back in 2000, I believe it was 10, and that was through a company that I was working with at the time. And Greg is, in my opinion, there are many, many phenomenal educators, practitioners in our industry. But in my mind, Greg is he's at the very top with these because of his practicality, his efficiency, and his consistency, besides his passion and his knowledge, which are above what normal people should have anyway. But he's personally worked on me, and the minimal stuff that he did with me had made a huge impact on me specifically. I had a left hip issue, and after about 10 minutes with Greg, that left hip issue has never ever come back. I've never had that same thing, and I've learned so much from him. So I'm just validating him to set the stage for what we're doing. So let me just really quick introduce a couple of concepts, and then we'll let Greg talk about how these things influence. So first and foremost, this webinar has a few purposes. One, it's a precursor to a new course that Patrick Warmill, our tactical training specialist and manager, and myself are developing, which is a preparation recovery course. Really trying to be more practical with how we prepare and how we recover and what those terms actually mean and how we can address that. Some of the stuff that Greg is talking about will be seen in a very rudimentary form in those because we're at a rudimentary level. As personally, I've gone through his process, the full body jumpstart process, which is a level 1. He has basically 3 different levels that he goes through. So we're going to implement. So what we're talking about is going to be seen in there, and I just want people to hear it from the person who developed it, because it wasn't developed by myself or Patrick or Eleiko. It was developed by him, but we're going to use some of those concepts and principles to help people moving forward. So I just want you to be on the lookout for that. That'll be a preparation recovery course coming out in a few months. Now, to set the stage for what we're going to talk about, I want to first just talk about, in order to produce a positive adaptation, we need 2 primary things in simplicity. We need stress and we need recovery. Stress is everything that you will experience 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's every incoming sensation that's influencing the body to try to knock it out of its homeostasis. That's it. That's the simplest definition of stress. But if you cannot recover from that, and we'll talk about recovery as we go through this, then that stress has deleterious or deleterious effects on the body. So most of us that are on this call probably have something to do with resistance training. And that being said, I want to shoot a quick poll just to give a feel for who we are and who's on this call. Is in this poll, I just want to find out how many of you are a strength coach or a personal trainer and or a group trainer. You're an athlete or a fitness professional or a fitness enthusiast, I'm sorry. or you're just an owner, operator, facility manager, or something else. I just want to get a quick tally on that so we kind of understand who's on the call. And we've got a pretty good response. I'll give you 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, excellent. So Greg, out of about 70% of the people that have voted, this is what we have. So we have about 19% strength coach, personal trainer 16, athletes and fitness enthusiasts seem to be predominant, and we have some others. Be curious if you want to drop in the question tab, if you're an other, what that might be. All right, let's move on. So, because we're related to strength training, most of us, as an athlete or fitness enthusiast, you're probably doing some form of resistance strength training. If you've read the research, we know that there's massive value to strength training. It increases all kinds of things, everything from obviously your strength, power, endurance, hypertrophy, bone mineral density, mental, emotional, cognitive abilities, all those great things. And it's been shown to decrease systemic inflammation, risks of injuries, and all that stuff. However, in order for that to actually work, the muscle tissue has to be working properly, because muscle is the force generating tissue of our soft tissue complex. I'm sure there's a lot of people on here who know about fascia. I know fascia's had a big play in the last 10 years. That's one of the new buzzwords as well. But please realize that muscle tissue is what generates the tension that fascia transfers. So the one's the engine, the other one's the drivetrain. And that's the importance of that. Without the engine, there is no drivetrain. And that's one of the reasons why there's so many fascial injuries, because fascia is one of the biggest injuries, because it can't do the work by itself. It needs that muscle tissue to generate force. And Greg will elaborate on that a little bit more. But that's what we have to understand, because you'll see in research that research shows that weakness can be the cause of musculoskeletal injury, but they never really determined what type of weakness that really is. Because just because you strength train does not mean that you're going to get stronger on a prolonged, consistent basis without getting injured. And in fact, most of the time, people who strength train end up getting injured. They get some type of musculoskeletal injury. So that being said, Greg, you and I have had many conversations about this and kind of defining strong, weak, what that actually means. From your perspective, from you, the Matt perspective, can you kind of tell us what the missing link is and that definition might be when you're looking at strong and weak and how that works with Matt?
Yeah, I think the biggest key coming from it, starting my career as a strength coach. And as you talked about, I had the fractured vertebrae when I was 19, and but I was strong. I mean, I worked out my whole life. I got the job as a strength coach because that's what I did. I worked out my whole life, and so it just fit perfectly into what I enjoyed doing. And but then I had this fractured vertebrae, and it sacrificed my last year of football in small school in Iowa, but got the job. It actually was a perfect situation, because the job opened up at Fresno State as their first assistant strength and conditioning coach. And so it allowed me to start my career, which if I stayed an extra year to play football, who knows where I would have been at this point. But I got the job as a strength coach, and I'm working out, I'm strong, and I'm getting all these athletes and setting them up on their programs. And we know that as strength coach at the university or high school level, the majority of people get bigger, faster, and stronger from conventional routines and strength and conditioning. But there's those certain people that don't have positive effects. And ironically, as I'm the strength coach and getting a little older, and now basically in my early 20s, and next thing I knew, I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction. I had one injury after another, but I was still strong. I wore knee wraps, I wear weight belts, I had orthotics, I had all these artificial forms of stability that were trying to help do what muscles were supposed to do. Because you can have strength, but you may not have stability. And that was probably the key. And when you don't have the stability component of muscle function, then the muscles can't do their job to stabilize joints and protect you from injury. So when I talk about muscle weakness, we're looking at it from a little different perspective. In a way, it is still about the muscles aren't as strong as they could be potentially. They're not functioning at their highest level or maximum capacity, but you can still have strength. And but you see exactly what you said. You see all these people, they continue to work out and eventually they get injured. And I remember I would sit and, I mean, when I would teach it through courses at IDEA, I'd have 100 people in a class and say, how many people have clients that have pain? And they'd all raise their hand. And I said, how many people in here have pain? And everyone would raise their hand. And it's like, well, there's something wrong with the industry because we represent the healthy. And we represent the healthy, but we're all broken down. And we're going to teach people to do what we do. I mean, we have our beliefs in how we train. And if it's not working for us, how do we expect it's going to work for our clients? And so one of the things that I learned, because I had the fractured vertebrae, I was chronically tight. And I mean, I could barely bend to touch my knees, let alone my toes. And so I went out and I started seeking out specialists in all fields. I had the opportunity early on to work with some physical therapists that really looked at the biomechanics of movement. I went on to work with Gary Gray. This is over 30 years ago. And I learned from Gary Gray, I mean, the best in the industry when you want to talk about functional training, functional movement. Even all the myofascial work right now, or fascial planes and training, is all based off of Gary Gray's integrated work. And I mean, it's all with those same concepts. So I was a range of motion functional movement specialist, and I developed a whole career. I started having people do functional training. I do range of motion assessments, and through all these top specialists, I was doing, I mean, learning how to do deep tissue work, PNF stretching, all these different modalities to try and increase range of motion. But the problem was every time I would stretch or get deep tissue massage, I couldn't get out of bed the next day because I'd have numbness and sciatica down into my big toe. Now, literally, I'm 25 years old thinking, what's wrong with me? And but I was strong. I was still working out and I was still working through it. But I was finding that when I was trying to increase my range of motion, I was violating, what it turned out, I was violating protective mechanisms and the body was reacting negatively. But as a range of motion functional movement specialist, I was applying these principles. I got hired by the Utah Jazz through the Stockton Malone era. I was working with the Denver Broncos. I'm just starting my 27th season with the Denver Broncos. And I was hired in pro sports as this range of motion functional movement specialist. Now, the key is you can do anything with athletes and still have success. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So if you're putting forces on their body and their body can tolerate it, it's going to figure out how to benefit from it. But then as I got away from the athletes and started working more with some of the general public, I found that a lot of the principles that I was doing with the athletes didn't carry over to the non-athletic people. And I was one of those. Even though I was athletic, I was a strength coach. Once I had the injury, the integrity of my neuromuscular system started to decline. And then my body had to compensate for the initial fractured vertebrae, and then you're putting all these forces on the body that it couldn't tolerate. And so I ended up in chronic pain. And so again, the foundational principle, and every specialist that I sought out, from chiropractic, physical therapy, podiatry, I mean, looking at foot mechanics, and the common denominator in every field was that you're tight. And that's basically, tightness is the cause of all your injury. It's causing bad mechanics, putting increased stress on other joints and tissue. And so the idea is everyone had their way through chiropractic adjustments, through deep tissue work, through stretching techniques. Everyone had their way to loosen up tight tissues. And I implemented this. And like I said, I got hired at the pro sport level doing this. And then being hired by the Utah Jazz, I worked with the team chiropractor, Craig Bueller, who did clinical kinesiology, and he did muscle testing. Part of his process was muscle testing. And so he went through and showed, I mean, we'd work together. We'd spend hours working with John Stockton. I'd do my work and he'd do his work. And our goal was to keep John Stockton playing. I mean, all the other players on the team, but John was our main guy. And so one day I was going through, and Bueller did all his tests on John Stockton, and then I did my work, and he was limited in hip rotation. So I did my stretching and PNF work, the deep tissue work, and loosened up his hip. When I got done loosening up his hip, Bueller came back and started testing muscles, and they were now testing weak. And prior to me doing my work, they were actually testing strong. And he literally looked at me and he said, "What did you just do?" And all I could think is, well, that can't be a good thing, because he was strong and now he's weak. And I mean, I didn't understand the whole muscle testing part, but it's like, this can't be a good thing. So I always had that voice in my ear saying, "What did you just do?" And so I started looking at it and said, wow, I just stretched him and I made him weak. And so I started looking. I got all the testing books from clinical kinesiology that Alan Beardall developed, and started looking at all the tests and positions, and so evaluated my own work. And that's probably one of the biggest keys with muscle testing, is it allows you to evaluate what happens when you put force on the body. When I was testing, or when I was doing range of motion and functional training, conceptually, this is what's going to help you. We always think, well, we have an opinion. This is what's going to help you based on our biomechanical understanding, whatever that may be. And I did all this work with Vladimir Janda with upper cross and lower cross, and you got tight hip flexors and erectors and weak glutes and abdominals. And so I would stretch the tight and strengthen the weak. And 6 weeks later, they'd come back and their posture was still just as bad with that lumbar tilt, the anterior pelvic tilt and lumbar lordosis. And it's like, well, how do we know that what we're doing when we're giving people stretches and exercises, that it actually has a positive effect and it's doing what we say it's going to do? And once I started playing around with muscle testing, just at a general basis, all of a sudden my glutes and abdominals were supposed to be weak, but my hip flexors and erectors were supposed to be tight and strong or overactive. And I'd find, well, my hip flexors were weak and my glutes were strong. And I started testing on people that I had this subjective evaluation or subjective idea of what was going on with their body. And I gave them stretches and exercise based on this subjective assessment, and found that everything that I was doing was far off. I mean, I could have took darts and shot them with a picture of anatomy picture of the body, and probably would have had a better chance of saying that muscle's tight and that muscle's weak. Because how do you know? One of the things I've always said is how do you know? And so as I working and hearing Bueller say, "What did you just do?" I started playing around with the muscle testing, and I started realizing that wherever there was a limitation in range of motion, let's say I have a limitation in hip internal rotation, then all of a sudden I was always focusing on stretching piriformis, the external rotators, those are tight. And I started finding that the internal rotators were actually weak. So the muscles that move you there are the ones that actually are the problem. And you think of a tug of war, if you have 10 guys 250-pound guys on each side of a tug of war, I mean, and they're equal strength, that string's going to stay in the middle. They're all pulling and that string doesn't go anywhere. But if you knock 2 guys off of one side, all of a sudden the other side gets dominant and it pulls. So muscles are that way also, is you got these muscles that should pull equally on each side of the axis, that should have equal pull to maintain upright posture and normal postural alignment. That once you have muscles that go weak, and I'll explain that in a second, that weaken, all of a sudden the other side dominates. And so you could have, say, hamstring tightness because the hip flexors and quadriceps are weak, and we focus on the tightness, and abdominals could be weak also. We focus on the tightness when it may actually be the opposite side had guys knocked off, so they're not pulling as hard as they're supposed to. So the other side just pulling normally shows up as being tight. And so through my assessments and working with muscle testing with the chiropractor, with Greg Bueller, I started realizing that, man, wherever there's tightness, there's coinciding weakness. If they're limited in internal rotation, and that's what the Jumpstart book that you showed talked about is going to show, is that wherever there's a position of weakness, if I can't turn my head to the right, but I can turn my head to the left farther, it means that the muscles that rotate my head and cervical spine to the right can't contract efficiently. And so when we talk about weakness, whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And the best way that I can say it, it's like having loose battery cables. The nervous system sends the input and it's just not getting to the muscles. So they can't do their job to contract and contract on demand and to stabilize joints. So there is a weakness issue, but weakness shows up in the extremes of range of motion, because when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't fully shorten. So my right cervical rotators can't contract efficiently. So my left cervical rotators show up as being tight because the opposite muscles aren't pulling effectively. And when they can't pull effectively, it's like there's a problem. The first sign of neuromuscular weakness is protective tightness. The second sign is pain. If you keep putting forces on tissues that are weakened due to inflammation, then, I mean, the body's going to tighten up and protect. And if you put forces on those tissues, it's going to shout out in pain, literally saying, quit doing this until you fix the problem. And the best way that I can explain that or make a correlation is, if you ever sprained an ankle. When you sprain an ankle, first thing we need to understand is muscles have the contractile ability to stabilize joints. Ligaments don't. So ligaments are secondary tension regulators. And so when the muscle system gets overloaded, when you put too much force on a tissue, i.e. you're changing direction and all of a sudden, I mean, you're expecting these muscles to stabilize the lateral side of the foot, and you got too much force being transferred through that, and all of a sudden you exceed the force tolerance level of those muscles. The Golgi tendons fired as an overriding mechanism to shut down the muscles. Now the ligaments become the tension regulators, and basically the ligaments gets torn or sprain, whatever that may be, and so you have an injury. But the supporting muscle, the inflammation, and due to the overstress on the muscles, you have inflammation that actually weakens the muscles that support the ankle. So the ligament pain, or the diagnosis is you sprained your ankle, the focus is on the ligament, but it's the supporting muscles. You think about it when you try and walk on a sprained ankle. It's like you can't put any pressure on it. Not because the ligament, I mean, yeah, the ligament is sprained, but because the muscles aren't strong enough. Inflammation weakens muscles. And the muscles aren't strong enough to tolerate the body weight forces anymore. Ground reaction force, body weight, momentum, the muscles aren't strong enough to tolerate. So the nervous system literally recognizes that. It creates a protective tightening of every supporting muscle around that ankle, and then it shouts out in pain when you try and put any force on it. And then after a few days, it's like, oh, I can put a little bit more force. As the muscles start to get stronger, you can tolerate a little bit more force. And there's actually an inverse relationship between mechanoreception and nociception. Basically, mechanoreception, i.e. the sensitivity, the muscle spindle, it's muscle spindle activity that's going to create that, and we continue to create that reflexive contraction that allows the muscles to stabilize joints and contract through their full range of motion. So as you have the muscle spindle gets negatively affected by inflammation, it increases the sensitivity of the nociceptors, your pain receptor. So it takes less physical force to create a pain response. So that's why when you first sprain an ankle, you can't walk on it because it hurts so bad. As the muscles get stronger, i.e. the sensitivity of the muscle spindle increases, because the Golgi tendon organ just overrode the input from the muscle spindle, and that's what causes the shutdown of the muscles. Now all of a sudden you start getting increased sensitivity of the muscle spindle, then you can allow for more physical stress before you shout out in pain. So now you can take 3 or 4 steps before it starts hurting. And I've seen this on clients. We've had clients come in literally on crutches with sprained ankles, and they can't even walk, and all the supporting muscles around the ankle joint, the foot and ankle joint are weak. They can't contract on demand, and we find that through manual muscle testing. And then as we get those muscles activated, now they can contract, they can tolerate forces, and all of a sudden they stand up and walk, and they walk out of here without their crutches. It's like it's an immediate response of, in normal circumstances, it may take a couple weeks before you can actually get back to performance. This is doing what time will do in a normal situation. So when you talk about the word recovery, this speeds up the recovery process, whether it's due to overuse on the muscles through training or it's due to an injury like a sprained ankle. But the idea is, whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, so that the muscles can't contract efficiently. When they can't contract efficiently, they can't do their job to stabilize joints and protect you from injury, and they basically, as you keep putting forces on it, it doesn't allow you to heal.
Yeah, and Greg, I want to bring up a few things because you said a lot of great stuff, and in there are a lot of words that we always hear. And I'm going to start with stability, because when people hear the word stability, they think of some type of stability training. I got to do this. I've got to be on one leg. I'm on a Swiss ball. Whatever. They think of that. When you're referring to, and when we talk about stability that the muscle tissue provides, the activation of muscle tissue, can you tell us, it's not about that, but how does that, what does that mean when we say stability? Because it's not a form of training, it's a function of the tissue, and how does that work? And I know that you kind of brought in and talked about the muscle spindle. Hopefully everyone on this call is familiar with the muscle spindle, and that it's basically a tension receptor, even though it's called a stretch receptor. It's a tension, because a lot of times people, especially in anatomy books, physiology books, you get the notion that the muscle spindle only activates when the muscle is stretched.
Okay.
And that's not technically true, because it has to be, and maybe you can explain this too, it has to be functioning properly for the muscle to shorten.
Yes.
Not just stretch. It does, but it's basically a full tension regulator. So can you kind of mix the stability with that? Because those kind of go hand in hand, because we have to have that function in order to get the stability function of the tissue, which then leads to what we were talking about with all the inflammation, and we'll get there in a second.
Yeah, and that's a huge point. The muscle spindle, it regulates changes in length of tissue and rate of change in length in tissue. So we always correlate it with lengthening. When it's stretched, it's a reflexive response that happens at the spinal cord level. When you have a stretch on the muscle, reflexively the nervous system will try and restore that muscle back to its normal resting length. So it creates a reflexive contraction. You stretch it, it's trying to shorten back to its normal resting length. Now, when the muscle shortens, under normal circumstances, when the muscle shortens, and so basically there's no stretch on the muscles, it's all based on tension of the interfusal fibers that make up the muscle spindle. And when the muscles shorten, these interfusal fibers could potentially shorten also. In the sensory, and that's when we talk about sensory input, if there's no tension on the interfusal fibers that make up the muscle spindle, there's no feedback to the central nervous system. It's the tension on the interfusal fibers that create a reflex or a responsive muscle contraction. When the muscle stretches, that happens no matter what, because as the extrafusal fibers lengthen, so do the interfusal fibers. But as the extrafusal fibers shorten, there's some, through higher centers, through alpha gamma coactivation, higher centers maintain tension on this interfusal fiber so that it can continually respond to forces regardless of the length of the tissue. Now I go back to when you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. It alters that information from higher centers that stimulates the gamma motor neuron that maintains tension on the interfusal fibers. So basically, it's the slow twitch muscle fibers, which is interesting. It's the slow twitch muscle fibers that get negatively affected by inflammation. And this kind of throws me off. Mayo Clinic did research years ago in the 90s and showed that people with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue have a greater density of fast twitch muscle fibers. How does that happen? It's like fast twitch, that means they're powerful. That means they're strong. No, they're the weakest people you'll ever find, because they have so much inflammation that their muscles are so weak that they can't tolerate any amounts of force, so they're in chronic pain. But what happens is you can't change the genetic makeup of muscle fiber characteristic, but you can change the metabolic characteristics. And so basically what happens when you have inflammation, it negatively affects the contractile ability of the slow twitch fibers and the threshold to activation. So these slow twitch fibers pick up fast twitch characteristics. Their threshold to activation gets higher. So now that's the loose battery cable idea. The threshold to activation gets higher. The fatigability increases, so they're always fatigued. because you lose your oxidative capacity, because fast twitch motor units don't have oxidative capacity, so you fatigue a lot, the muscles fatigue a lot faster. So those all make sense. It's like, yeah, these muscles can't contract, they can't contract on demand, and then they fatigue, and that's what someone with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue feels like. And so I'm skipping off your question. When you talk about stability, the stability component is these muscles being able to contract and contract on demand and maintain contraction through ranges of motion. If you think about stability training, core stability, shoulder, scapular stability, we're holding ourselves in one position and saying, okay, now my scapula is stable, or oh, my core is stable. I mean, one of the most misunderstood areas that I will say from my perspective, just because I can test it on a day-to-day basis, is the core is the weakest area across the board on every client that walks in this door. And it's like, so what do people train the most? Their core. So there's a disconnect. And because when you think about stability training, holding your spine in neutral and lifting your arms, lifting your legs, the planks, and all of these exercises, when I don't even think I brought it up, but when you think about instability, and you say when you walk on ice, what's the first thing you do when you walk on ice? You tighten up as a protective mechanism. If you did EMG recordings and measured the contractile component of muscle, or basically the amount of muscle contraction on somebody walking on ice, the numbers would go out the roof. So is that stability, or is that doing, I'm going to contract anything and everything I can to try and not slip and fall and injure myself? So I think what we get is we get all this increased electrical activity because the muscles are contracting to try and maintain the core stability in neutral when we lift our arms and we lift our legs. But the problem is we don't function in neutral. We function through the extremes. If I swing a golf club, I'm not trying to keep my spine in neutral. I need that thing rotating. I need it going through, all motion in all three planes. And there's a lot of rotation, a lot of side bend. The flexion that you're in, and then you go into the opposite motions as you swing through the other direction. And so all of these movements have to occur away from neutral. Neutral is the position that we revert to when we're unstable. That's the position we're the most stable in. So we actually train ourselves we get stronger in the position that we revert to when we're unstable. And where most people lose, and what happens when we talk about stability is what happens when you walk on ice, the natural neurological response is when the body senses instability, it's going to tighten up as a protective mechanism. The minute you step off the ice, all of a sudden you don't have to protect anymore. Well, when you have muscle weakness due to stress, trauma, or overuse, this contractile, the firing mechanisms are altered, then it's an instability issue. And the natural neurological response is to tighten up, because the body knows that it can't move into the extremes of range of motion, because when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't fully shorten. That shortened position is the position where we are the weakest. So neutral is the position where we're the strongest. And that's the position we're going to revert to. Oh, and you think about it. People don't have pain sitting like this, or they're standing up. Oh, yeah, when I turn here, it hurts. When I rotate, oh, yeah, that hurts. When I internally rotate, oh, yeah, that hurts. When I bend to touch my toes, oh, that hurts. Pain, the first sign of neuromuscular weakness is protective tightening from not allowing you to move in those positions of instability, which are the extremes of range of motion. The second sign is pain. You bend down and you move into that extreme range and violate that motion, your body shouts out and says, and pain says, quit doing this until you fix the problem. So the extremes of range of motion are the weakest. When you have muscle inhibition or weakness, it's in the extremes of range of motion. You can be strong and neutral, because that's what we revert to when we're unstable. It's the extremes. So stability, it's not about stability training to make you stronger and neutral. It's to make you stability training says, I need stability through greater ranges of motion so that the opposite muscles don't need to tighten up and protect me from moving into that range. And I don't get pain going into that range, because the body knows that that is a position of stability. So with muscle activation techniques, we're looking at stability through motion, not stability in one position, because that's a position we revert to when we're unstable.
And Greg, to that point with the position, when you're with your testing process and when you're doing the range of motion assessments, you're looking for one symmetry, but when you test, I don't want to just give the answers out, but I want people to realize that when he's talking about a couple things, when you're talking about the stability mechanism and you're talking about the strength of the tissue, you're testing for strength and it's in range, meaning it's shortened position. So you take a muscle, whether it's your external rotators in your shoulder, you want to go into external rotation. Now there's various degrees, but just going into external rotation, and then you want to test, can we hold that? Can that muscle activate on demand, or does it go and then it gets strong in this particular area? So when it can't activate on demand, that muscle is technically considered weak because it can't turn on and fire when you need it to fire. So what Greg is saying is, if we can get that muscle to hold at its in range of motion, now the caveat being is everyone's in range of motion will be slightly different because of everyone's mechanics is slightly different. But if I can get my external rotators to hold at this in range of motion, when I have some type of force placed upon me, then they're able to activate on demand. When that happens, we will have stability. That tissue now has stability, provided that other things are also working in that particular area. But if that doesn't hold, that means there's a weakness. Therefore, there is the opportunity to have either shoulder pain or some other pain that's going to be related because of that particular area, which is, that's another conversation in and of itself. But I think the important thing I really want people to see is, what Greg's saying, if you don't have a way of finding out what is potentially causing an issue, or where there's a lack of motion, or where there's a lack of on-demand strength, that is going to be a precursor to something else not happening. Meaning there's a precursor to having some form of what we would call injury, because it's either going to create some type of weakness or some type of pain that's going to happen. We're not going to have the range of motion. Something's going to get tight, and then something's going to get potentially sore if it continues to be in that position or in that same state for the time.
And I'm going to give a little example. And I mean, I told you I was a range of motion functional movement specialist, and I got hired at the pro level. And I mean, they were in 2 different sports with this background, and almost 30 years ago. And I understood biomechanics and if you have pain here, it could be coming from somewhere else. How the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, all the way to the occiput are interrelated. And if you have abnormal motion at one joint and tissue, it can put increased stress. I mean, this is a whole myofascial thought process too. It's all pulling together from different angles throughout the body. But the key is we're only as strong as our weakest link. And so when I was looking at a range of motion, I had a guy come in. This is my first year with the Broncos. I had a guy right before training camp. He comes in and he woke up and his back was tight. And he came in, he saw me, I stretched him out. His hip, he had 0 internal rotation in his hips. Basically I checked 90-90 internal rotation and it didn't turn. And so that's part of pronation. And he's got back pain because he's not getting motion in his hip. I stretched out his hip and increased his range of motion, say 5 or 10 degrees. And then he went and saw I won't bury myself on this alone. He went and saw the chiropractor, and then he said, got massage. And he comes back out, he walks by the door where I'm working, and he walks by and he goes, I feel awesome. I'm so loose. Literally 5 minutes later, they bring him in and he pulled a hamstring. And we were hired to prevent these things. And this is why when I'm sitting here with this voice going through, what did you just do when I made the John Stockton week, which I'm playing around with muscle testing, but I hadn't made any type of adaptation yet. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go down with the chiropractic massage there. We're all down together. But our job was to prevent that. He walked out mobile, but he was unstable. And all I can say, because of what I know now, is that we increased his range of motion. We provided mobility without stability. We violated the protective mechanism. We opened up ranges that were unstable, and now he was an injury waiting to happen. And I know that now, and that's that. What did you just do? You just made him weak. You put forces on muscle tissues that are weak. The first thing that's going to do is tighten up and protect. The second, it's going to shout out in pain saying, there's a problem. I can't tolerate these forces, and now I'm injured. And that was the eye-opening day. The second thing that always haunts me is that, I mean, we set this guy up for injury, or we didn't prevent it. I wouldn't say, I mean, in the main key is we didn't prevent the injury, and that's what we were hired for. And so then all of a sudden I started recognizing and changed everything in my thought process, that it's not about tightness. This tightness is part of the protective mechanism. And if you violate the protective mechanism, if you have mobility without stability, you have vulnerability for injury. The body's tightening up for a reason. And athletes are great at this. They can have weaknesses, but they protect so much and tighten up so much that they can compensate for their weaknesses. But there's a certain point in time when people no longer have enough strong muscles to compensate for their weak muscles. And that's when Pandora's box opens up. And those are the non-athletes that have years of compensation and adaptation, one injury after another. And that was me. I had one injury after another. At 25 years old, I'm sitting there, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? Because I was chronically tight. And I mentioned it earlier, I could barely bend down to touch my knees, let alone my toes. And the first time, I had a guy working for me and I was training him and doing the work, and I mean, having him do it on me. The first time I got my hip flexors and abdominals activated, my hamstrings and erector spinae were tight. I got my hip flexors and abdominals activated, and I bent down and touched my toes for the first time in 10 years. Then I knew I was onto something. I've been stretching this, and I mean, negative effects from stretching and deep tissue massage. How many people stretch day after day after day and they never get any more flexible? And it's because you haven't melted the ice. The goal of muscle activation techniques is to melt the ice. Provide a sense of stability and the body will give you all the mobility in the world. So now we go back to what you're saying, the extremes of range of motion. The weaknesses show up in the extremes. When you can't contract, you can't fully shorten. Structure dictates function, and it's a function of the muscles that dictate whether or not the structure can move the way it's designed to move. The structure dictates that I should have a lot of motion in cervical rotation. The function of the muscles dictate, oh, you can't turn your neck to the right like you can to the left. The function of the muscles dictate, unless there's some bone changes or some arthritic changes, things like that, unless there's arthritic changes, then the structure, then you change the structure, it says now you can't move that way because that's what the structure dictates. But the muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. And when muscles can't contract efficiently, there's a force tolerance level, and this is what you were touching on, there's a force production level that basically says, I'm weaker. I remember Ed McCaffrey 25 years ago saying, how can you tell me my hamstrings are weak? I can do the stack on the hamstring curl machine. That's the touchy subject about when we say muscle weakness. But he had semi-membranosus, semi-tendinosus were all testing strong. The bicep femoris, long head, and short head were testing weak. He had divisions of those muscles, which means now as a whole, his knee flexion capability, his knee flexor capabilities were less than what they should have been. They were less than optimal, even though he could lift the stack. But he was limited in range of motion. He couldn't fully flex his knee on the side that his hamstrings were weak. His quads were tight. Everyone was focusing on the tightness and the quadriceps. It was the weakness in the hamstring. When we got the long head of the bicep and the short head of the bicep activated, all of a sudden the quadricep tightness went away and he could fully flex the right knee like he could the left. So when you increase the ability for muscles to contract in the extremes of range of motion, the end ranges of motion that the structure dictate, those muscles will be stronger throughout their full range of motion. It's when it's the extreme, and I could do manual muscle testing at mid-range, and that muscle will be, I could, with a force dynamometer, they can produce a lot of force. In the extremes of range of motion, it's like they can't even, match 5 pounds of force. They break on less than 5 pounds of force, the muscle would give out. So that's why the body's protecting. It's like, I can't even tolerate 5 pounds of force, and you're going to be out there doing hamstring curls with the stack. I'm not going to let you move into that range. So the body tightens up as a protective mechanism. And that's what and anytime you violate that protective mechanism, you're opening up ranges that are unstable, and now you have vulnerability for injury.
Yeah, and Greg, I want to, in the last few minutes we have, I want to touch on two kind of, I want to say incomplete conceptions, misconceptions slightly, is want to touch on recovery a little bit, because that's related to what we're talking about, and then I want to get into the activation real quick. So I know recovery is a massive buzzword right now, and everyone's fired up on recovery. And I want to make it clear that most people who are doing recovery, they do these techniques, may not even understand what they're recovering from. Because ultimately, and you and I have talked about it, and you've already mentioned it many, many times, but what you're really recovering from is the inflammation cycle. Because even though, and you've talked about ankle sprain, you've talked about some injury, but the body will represent overuse, or you had a really difficult workout and you're sore. That is technically an injury that has induced an inflammation response, which is a good thing. We need to have inflammation because that's the healing process. However, when it's too extreme or it's prolonged and the body starts getting dysfunctional, that's when inflammation is sustaining, and that's what basically knocks the type 1 muscle fibers offline. And that's where we can start getting the change in their metabolic or their activation characteristics. Means that we don't have on-demand activation. And I think that's what people need to realize is one huge concept is just because you're doing a recovery technique does not mean that you are recovered. It means that you did a recovery technique. And you don't know if you're actually recovered because you may feel great. You laid in a cold pool, or you did some type of infrared sauna, or you did a foam roll, or you did whatever you did for recovery. That does not necessarily mean you're recovered. It means you did something that was recovery oriented. But if your body isn't functioning properly and you have no way to test it or no way to determine, am I in a state that I feel that I'm capable of moving, then it doesn't mean anything. And I think that's really important for us to touch on. That's the important thing. That's why inflammation is the key to all of these things, because inflammation is ultimately what will determine potentially the activation, the characteristics, the metabolic characteristics, and the state of recovery that we're going to be in. And since we can't do biopsies and take blood samples all the time to find out what our inflammatory state is, we can do some type of assessment process that will give us an indication, and sometimes range of motion is an indication. Sometimes the amount of tightness is an indication. And or can you put yourself in a position and then create some type of in range of motion isometric contraction, and does that actually hurt? Now, I don't mean pain. I mean, it's like, oh, I can't hardly hold that position. And so I think that's where, and I'm speaking from personal experience. So I've gone through a lot of the same things that Greg has. I played football for many years, and I've had multiple injuries. I donated a kidney 3 years ago, and that created a whole cascade of events that had issues. And I was just telling Greg, I had issues where all of a sudden my left knee hurt. My left kidney was removed, gave it to my younger brother, but all of a sudden I started having these left leg problems, and I had this knee thing. And so I went through Greg's process, and I did some activation, some self-activation on my core, looking at various things in my core. Just did that and some hip things. I just went through a process, and I just used what the book told me. And I texted Greg later that day. I said, I went running for the first time in 2 years, and I didn't have any knee pain. And there was tension, but it wasn't. So I made sure that I kept it at a very low level. So what I'm saying is that if you don't have a way to do something, you don't understand the physiological principles that we're talking about, we're really throwing, like Greg said, we're just throwing darts at the anatomy board, and we think that something's happening. But all of these physiological principles that we were supposed to hear in our certification courses or go through in our medical trainings, if we don't understand how those are actually being utilized, we're still throwing darts at the dartboard with an expensive education.
Yeah.
And so that's what I want to bring to life with what Greg was saying with the inflammation process. And please realize, just because you do a recovery technique does not mean that you are recovered. Don't fool yourself. Get a process that allows this to happen. This is one of the reasons why Patrick and myself are developing this preparation recovery course, because it incorporates this. It's not the perfect scenario. It's not the perfect storm, because you can't all go to Greg Roskopf, and you can't go, but he does have a plethora of people And there's a link in there where you can find a community of people who do this. And he does have online education, and he does have all these things that we'll hit the links for. Actually, I'll put those links up right now. And then it's also in the handout I gave you. So there's a bunch of links that I just put in the chat. But I want to bring that to life. And then the other thing I want to bring to life that Greg talked about was recovery. I'm sorry, it was activation. When Greg said that he activated his abdominals and his hip flexors and was able to touch his toes, and when I said that I activated some of the musculature in my core and my hips that I didn't realize were the way they were, because I thought that I was doing enough, because I thought that. But when you get a little bit more specific, when we're talking about activation, Greg, we're not talking about going out and doing crunches and doing hip flexion. And I only use the isoangular, the positional activation strategy. Right. I only use that, just isometric. Greg has two different processes that he can show you. But I want to just touch on that a little bit and how that works from the last couple minutes that we have is the isometric component, because that's kind of what we're going to be showing in our preparation recovery course and what we do in Eleiko education. But that came from Greg, and it'll obviously be referenced. And again, that's all in his book that you can get in one of those links as well.
And that's the key. And like you said in that book, the Jumpstart, it's an introduction to the principles of MAT and everything we're talking. But like Rodney said, he was able, if you're a practitioner in the field, you can do self-evaluations. And one of my phrases I always use, especially I said structure dictates function. It's the function of the muscles that dictate whether or not the structure can move the way it's designed to move. I always say, I don't care what you can do. I want to know what you can't do, because what you can't do is breaking you down. So even going through the range of motion assessment that we have in the Jumpstart book, that gives you so much information. I used to do range of motion assessments to determine what was tight on the athletes and the people I was working with. Then after I learned in muscle testing, what I identified, which is all in this Jumpstart book, is I use range of motion assessment to tell me what you can't do, what muscles can't contract the way they're designed to move. Because if the structure dictates, like I said, that you should be able to fully rotate to the right, but your muscle system says you can't, that means the muscles that move you there aren't contracting efficiently. Not that the opposite muscles are tight, they're tight as a protective mechanism. So with Rodney, what he did is self-evaluation, and when even with me, oh yeah, I couldn't touch my toes for 10 years, and it's like, well, my muscles couldn't contract, so they couldn't fully shorten, and the opposite muscles showed up as being tight. So you can go through all these assessments, and I always say it's a muscle-specific range of motion assessment, where it's like the structure, these are the muscles that will rotate your spine. If you're a golfer and you're trying to improve your rotation, you can stretch all you want, but until you actually get the muscles activated that rotate you through the extremes of range of motion, you're going to be weak and you're going to be vulnerable, and your body will continue to tighten up, and it will continually shout out with back pain saying there's a problem here. And so then you identify what are the muscles. And the neat thing is Rodney went through and he had knee pain, and he activated muscles in his core. Because the range of motion assessment said, ooh, I don't even know which ones it was, but it's like, ooh, I can't turn to the left like I can to the right. That means I need to do isometric, low intensity, and this is the MAT process, low intensity isometrics in the shortened position of the muscles. The Jumpstart looks at it as positional weaknesses, where there's a whole group of muscles that rotate you to the left and rotate you to the right. But if you can't rotate to the left and you do an isometric contraction into that direction, not a PNF back into the lengthened position, it's into the shortened position, that starts to retrain the brain and create the ability for the muscles to contract through a shortened range, and that start to increase that slow twitch, get back those slow twitch characteristics, redefine those slow twitch characteristics so that the muscle can contract. The threshold to activation gets higher, then it can contract on demand, then it can do its job to stabilize joints and protect you from injury. The isometrics are done in the shortened range for that reason, because that's where we're the weakest. That can get the muscles activated through its full range and take away the protective tightening. Now, all this is in the book, and we get all different education options that explain the technique, that get into every single muscle, how to test them, how to treat them. I mean, the whole process is pretty in-depth. Now, inflammation, when Rodney's talking about recovery, there's this, I mean, idea out there that inflammation is a bad thing. I mean, it's the buzzword from you got to cut out inflammatory foods, and inflammation is killing people, and it is. The common denominator behind every disease out there is inflammation. The unresolved inflammation is the term you want to use. That you're chronically inflamed, or they call it in the medical world subclinical inflammation. Inflammation is the, common denominator from coronary heart disease, diabetes, Parkinson's, MS. The inflammation is the common denominator behind every disease. So we are so focused that we need to get rid of inflammation. The end result of an inflammatory response is healing and growth and repair of tissue. That's why you say when you exercise, we're going to break you down, you're going to get sore, then you recover, and you recover stronger. The nice thing about that is when you're young and athletic, all that stuff works. When we're young and we're systemically, when we're older and our nervous system, we put more stresses on our body, the fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue people, they're already inflamed. The last thing you want to do as a trainer, I'll say this, is make somebody sore when they already have subclinical inflammation, because now you're compounding the inflammatory response. So that's what we have to think about, is they have unresolved inflammation. When you have an injury like a sprained ankle, all the inflammatory chemicals are being released to start that healing process. Ward out the area, tighten everything up, ward it out to start the healing process. Then you get all the metabolic waste products out of there. The tissues can start to recover and heal. And that's what recovery is. And the tissue actually gets stronger. Inflammation is a good thing when you get to the resolution phase of inflammation. Well, you'll see when I mention fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, every one of you, if you're in the sport exercise environment, everyone knows what it feels like to overtrain. If you look up the overtraining, the symptoms related to overtraining, it's the exact same symptoms that you'll see with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. Everything from digestive issues to irritability to you can't sleep, insomnia, muscle aches and pains, muscle tightness. That's unresolved inflammation. The problem with somebody with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue is the integrity of their neuromuscular system is so low that everyday activity is too much force for their bodies that they can handle. That's why they try and exercise. I don't care who's the best trainer in the world, you're not going to be able to set those people on an exercise program without preparing their body to be able to tolerate the forces that will come with exercise. Otherwise, all you're going to do is push them further down the downward spiral, because it's all about force tolerance. Your muscles have a certain tolerance level of how much force they can tolerate. After I sprain an ankle, my muscles can't tolerate very much force. Now MAT can help improve that tolerance level immediately, and that's the whole goal, is make those muscles so they can tolerate more force. Then you can get them out of the acute state of inflammation into the growth and repair or healing state of inflammation. That's the whole goal of MAT, is to get people out of, because the tolerance levels are so low when you have inflammation, it can be localized like a sprained ankle, or it can be systemic because you're in a disease state. But if you think of the surface area of the muscle, the mass, our whole body, there's so much muscle tissue. And if somebody with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, they say they have a weak immune system. No, they have an overactive immune system, because their tissue, the immune cells are continually getting sent to the muscle tissues, because every time they put forces on them, they're in this overtrained state. They're in a catabolic state rather than an anabolic state. So they're in this ingrained state that they can't heal. So you got all these inflammatory chemicals going to the area trying to do what it's supposed to do, repair the damaged tissue. But because tolerance levels are so low, it's like sprinting on a sprained ankle, they can never heal. They keep going out and sprinting and putting forces on their body, but their body can't tolerate the forces that come with everyday activity. So now the goal is you have to raise the tolerance levels so, one, they can handle their own body weight. Then you can start the process to heal. So when Rodney's talking about recovery, and you're talking about forces, many of the recovery models, I don't care if you lie or you're in an ice tub or lying in the infrared or anything like that. Those are not the real specific forces on tissues. But when you have inflammation, what do you typically have? Pain. Pain is a part of one of the signs and symptoms of inflammation. If there's tissue that's irritated, it's sore. Oh, my hamstrings are sore because I worked out yesterday. And so now I'm going to dig into your hamstrings and irritate tissue that's already irritated. Those tissues are actually saying, leave me alone. I need to heal. I need to recover and heal. And so putting force on tissue that's already irritated can slow down the recovery process. Movement is a good thing. Get movement, get circulation, get blood flow, but the more forces you put, especially isolated forces on tissue, the greater chance you have of compounding the inflammatory response, which in turn slows down the potential healing. So you have to you have to say, what is true recovery? Recovery is allowing tissues that are inflamed, allowing them to be able to be in an environment where they can recover and heal. MAT speeds up that process because the goal of MAT is we're going to get those muscles that inflammation negatively affected the contractile ability, so now they're weaker. We're going to tighten those battery cables, get those muscles to be able to contract on demand, and literally muscle soreness goes away immediately. And because now they're in that, out of the acute state of inflammation into the healing state of inflammation, and then they can heal. Unless you go out and sprint again, and then it's like, okay, well, there's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But you got to be careful of putting forces on tissues that are already irritated can slow down the whole recovery process. And then one of the main phrases I always say is, how do you know? How do you know if you put a force on somebody's body that it had a positive or a negative effect? And one of the things with muscle activation techniques is you have the tools to be able to assess. I never knew that stretching could cause weakness. I was a strength coach. I was doing all this all these modalities as a functional movement range of motion guy. And then when I was exposed to manual muscle testing, I started finding out that, wow, I just stretched them, and because they were so tight, like the internal limitation and internal rotation, or me trying to stretch to touch my toes when I couldn't even touch my knees. It's like that stretching, actually, I would test the muscles, the hip flexors and abdominals after I would stretch. And I'd find out that even if they were strong, by the time I got done stretching, they went weak again. So you slow down the healing. Every time you make them weak, you're pushing them down the downward spiral. You get them activated, let them heal. Don't start forcing motion. Go through movement. The body knows what it can and cannot do based on the input from these sensory receptors, i.e. the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organ, and let the body heal on itself. But how do you know whether if you're a trainer and you put forces on somebody's body, one point in time, the stretch could have a positive effect, because I say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So if it doesn't shut you down, it actually has a positive effect, is why you can do it on athletes, healthy athletes. And if it does shut you down, it has a negative effect. So how do you know? One person could come in and you put the same modalities or recovery processes on one person, and it actually makes them feel worse. And on somebody else, it actually makes them feel better, because it actually, like jump starting your battery, then you drive your car, it reinforces it. But if you have a battery that's drained and you keep trying to start it, it just keeps draining the battery. And so you could have total different responses by people based on their force tolerance level and their lack of ability to recover and heal.
Excellent. Greg, real quick, just someone asked a question about if they want to learn more about inflammation and its role in the nervous system, muscular system. Do you have a good book or reference or something where you could send them? Because I know it's a tricky deal to try to find someone, one, who explains inflammation kind of simplistically, because a lot of the research and a lot of the places you go from websites, they're just like all over the place.
Yeah, I think the biggest key is, relative to what I do, I've put this whole process together with muscle activation techniques, and over 30 years, I've seen amazing changes in people's health and function, whether they're a high-level athlete and had injuries, or they're the fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and with systemic inflammation, and being able to make positive changes. There's so much information out there, like you said, Rodney, on inflammation. I'd literally start with the Jumpstart book, and it kind of explains just relative to muscle function. It gives you a very generic explanation of how this all works and why you have to look at it from this perspective. If you're putting forces on people's body as a trainer, as a strength coach, if you're putting forces on the body, you have to understand the role of those forces and what impact they can have. And inflammation is the key and behind that. So it is in the chapter in the book. I'd start there.
it's how he starts the book. So that's what I would strongly suggest for a lot of people. That's the easiest way to get accustomed to it, because when you get into you Google something or
yeah, and everyone's giving you supplements or medicines or anything like that.
Right.
The one thing that I'll finish off with, the big concept is I mean, the medical world, the huge aging, the aging dysfunction right now, or syndrome, the aging syndrome right now is called sarcopenia. And sarcopenia is basically muscle wasting. And basically, as we get older, our muscles lose their ability to tolerate forces. And I like what Rodney said at the beginning. There's a difference between muscle strength and fascial, I mean, this myofascial system. You still have to have muscle strength. The integrated system is only as good as the function of the isolated parts. This fascia encompasses these muscles, but it's the contraction of those muscles that stimulate fascial communication. So you have to have muscle contraction. Muscle strength is a key, and it's being looked at as the aging syndrome. So the medical world started looking at is, okay, everyone needs to work out. Well, the problem is all these people are already injured and broken down, and they try and work out, and it breaks them down even more because their body's not prepared to tolerate the forces that come with exercise. And now the researchers looking at sarcopenia have come up to the conclusion that there's another component that was missed. It's the neurological component. That's what MAT is all about. MAT tightens these battery cables, movement by movement, muscle by muscle, so that those muscles can start to contract, so they can start to tolerate forces, so then you can actually get stronger. I have clients that come in at 60, 65 years old, that we prepared their bodies so they can tolerate forces, and I take them through specific exercise, and they're actually getting stronger at 65 when they were broken down and couldn't get any types of strength. So in the right environment, you can prevent sarcopenia, because now their body's in an anabolic state rather than a catabolic state, because they kept breaking themselves down. When you think of inflammation as the common denominator behind every disease out there, and because all the muscles are being overloaded and never getting to the healing state of inflammation, muscle weakness and overloading muscles, exercise can actually contribute to disease. And that's totally contradictory, because exercise is supposed to be the cure-all for every disease out there. But if exercise is a stress and it's compounding the inflammation, it's compounding the symptoms that come with disease. And I see that on a day-to-day basis as my clients get stronger and their neuromuscular system, the integrity of their neuromuscular system improves, the symptoms related to their diagnosis or disease start to minimize, because you're reducing inflammation, getting them out of the catabolic state into the anabolic state of healing. And it doesn't matter whether you're a 20-year-old athlete or a 65-year-old ex-athlete, beat up, broken down for years. The potential, as long as you have the communication pathways intact, it's almost like rewiring a house. You just have to start from square one and rewire it, so then you can prepare the body to exercise and tolerate forces, so you actually can prevent the muscle wasting that comes with the sarcopenia and the aging disease.
Yeah. And Greg, one more thing to Shelley, who I promised we would address her situation. You talked about rheumatoid arthritis. Does MAT, can that help with that situation?
Rheumatoid arthritis is an inflammatory based disease and diagnosis, and it's with anything, the system stress, and I can guarantee you there's muscle weaknesses associated, because the other thing is, if you don't use it, you lose it. So when you have any form of inflammatory based issues, whether it's you have pain, chronic pain, most people don't work out, and anytime they try and work out, rheumatoid arthritis typically is going to make them feel worse. And so yes, I mean, I always say, who's MAT for? Everyone with a muscular system. I mean, everyone has a muscular system, and it's who's it the most important for is the people that are so chronically inflamed that their tolerance levels are so low that they can't handle the forces. And rheumatoid arthritis is one of those catabolic type state diseases that it's like the tissues are just so weak that they can't heal, which every time they try and do something, it compounds the inflammation, so it compounds the symptoms that come with that and the pain that's associated with it. So yeah, I mean, because the nice thing about even with the low level isometrics are you're not putting a lot of force on the tissue to get these muscles activated. It's literally 10% intensity of contraction in the shortened range of motion. And so that's not asking a lot. And then, oh, I'm going to go walk, and your muscles can't even tolerate all the forces of body weight, ground reaction force, momentum, and 3 times body weight. If you say that, it's like you gotta go backwards before you can go forward. So yes, MAT can help. That's literally, MAT is the precursor to exercise. If exercise is supposed to make you stronger, and it's not, and it doesn't, it's because the muscles can't tolerate the forces that you're putting on it. MAT is the precursor to get the muscles prepared to tolerate the forces. Then if you happen to break it down, your body will start to tighten up and it will shout out in pain, and then you put it back together again. So it becomes this it's as important as exercise. You break it down, you put it back together so that you can go do it again. And if you break it down, you put it back together, and over time it continues to get stronger. Right now, the downward spiral that we relate to aging has to do with failure of the muscle system to tolerate force. And this is the only process I know out there that actually addresses that.
And then lastly with this, Nicholas, you asked a question about should we train in zones of range of motion, meaning I'm assuming you're saying should we train in ranges of motion, and will there be less strength due to the overlap of the filaments? So that's a complicated question. I'm going to give you a really short answer. One, you only train in ranges or ranges that you can control. So don't just go put a load and start squatting full squats or deep squats if you've never done that. You have to make sure that the tissue. So the process that, and what Greg just said is one of the most important things. By no means is Greg saying you can't do this, 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 or this. He's saying if the body isn't prepared to do this, this, and this, then it's going to break down. I can attest to that because I've been teaching that for forever. That's why I'm attracted to Greg, is I understand exactly what he's saying. You have to prepare the body to do what you want it to do. And just because you go do something, strength training, does not mean that you're going to change the world. You will get stronger, but it doesn't mean that you're going to sustain that strength and or not break down. So when you do break down or something happens, you start getting some pains, what do you do to get over that? And so there are ways that you can prepare the body to do things to help the body recover better. So that's a simplistic thing. So you don't train in ranges of motion if you've never been there. And if you do train in ranges of motion, make sure the body can get to those in ranges of motion. And then it goes back to what Greg said. How do you know? How do you know you can get to end ranges of motion? Well, assess yourself. Assess yourself. Can you get to that end range of motion, first and foremost? Yes. And two, do you have some activation? Are you able to withstand some limit force? Don't start at a heavy load. Start at a much lighter load. That's what I'm going to tell you flat out. I've used this, and I've used components of this for a long time because I've known Greg for a long time. But I got specific with it over the last few months because of my kidney thing. And I was able to identify some key things that then allowed me to continue to do things and do them better than I was doing before. So I had to start there first before I started jumping into. So I do a lot of Olympic lifting, I do powerlifting, I do all those different types of lifts, and I do get into full ranges of motion. Sometimes I will break down. I will get certain things, but now I know what ranges of motion I'm kind of looking for, how to go through my body and figure out, ooh, that's not moving super well, and I've got some tightness here, therefore I try this. It comes back online, I get to go back and play it. So that's the simple process. It's just a loop of you did something, you tried something, you do something. It's not necessarily because the filaments are going to overlap and you don't have it really comes back to, is that muscle spindle able to gauge tension in a fully shortened position, not just a fully lengthened position? Because remember, anytime something's shortened, something's lengthening. Anytime something's lengthening, something's shortening. And so that's where this whole process helps to reboot the system or reconnect the cables to allow you to get into positions.
So, and one of the final things I'll say on that is the integrated system's only as good as a function of its isolated parts. And like Rodney's talking about doing clean and jerk, deadlifts, all that stuff. I mean, great ranges of motion. They require great ranges of motion. But a nice part is it's integrated. So so you can have weak links in the integrated system, and your body will figure out how to compensate it for it. The more isolated an exercise is, the greater chance it has of overloading the muscles, because you can't compensate for an isolated movement. And that's why the direct forces like deep tissue massage or stretching, you're going after certain muscles where there's vulnerability that says, well, I would have compensated for that. That's why I'm tightening up, because I don't want you to move me there. And so if you're doing isolated exercises, forcing into isolated movements into end ranges may not be a good thing, Because if you do a range of motion assessment and you're like, oh, I don't have great motion and external rotation of the humerus, then don't start doing isolated exercises under load. Go to the book and do isometric contractions to start stimulating. As you get more range and the muscles prove they can contract through the range, then start with high repetitions, low intensity exercises through that range of motion. But if you start doing exercises with a good, significant amount of load into ranges that your body's already protecting from, the chances are is you're going to compound the problem. So I always say, get the muscles activated, then let them become part of the integrated system. Don't go after the weaknesses with isolated strengthening, because you may break it down. But once you jumpstart the battery on your car, then you drive it, it reinforces it. So because basically then the muscles can fire and fire on demand. So let's say I had an external rotation problem in my right shoulder. And now all of a sudden it's like, wow, I got those activated. My range of motion is improved. That means the muscles can fire in demand. That means every time you do a snatch or a clean and jerk or anything like that, now they're involved and they're contracting just like every other muscle. So they have the opportunity to get stronger, even though you're not saying I'm doing isolated rotator cuff exercise. You're safe. You'd rather be safe than sorry. So let the muscles work in the integrated system more than saying I need to go after those isolated weak links. Go after those isolated weak links with isometric, low intensity isometric. Let them be involved in the compound movement, because if they're not strong enough to tolerate the movement, your body will compensate and bring in other strong muscles so that you don't injure yourself.
Awesome. So we're going to stop there. I deeply appreciate all of the people who stayed on for the full thing. I know we went over, but there's a lot of information, and this would take weeks.
Thank you very much for being here. Yeah.
So on behalf of Eleiko, want to thank everyone for jumping on and for being part of this. Don't forget the links. And Greg, I'll let you say your own goodbyes if you want to.
Yeah. Yeah, on behalf of MAT, I mean, thank you for being here and listening. I've had a great relationship with Rodney for 25 years. We always enjoy talking. We've had phone calls that we can't get off the phone because and the conversations just keep going. So really, we got to experience one of our talks, and it's motivating, it's exciting. But the neat thing is, I know from Rodney's standpoint and mine, I mean, the goal with what I do with MAT is to, help people. I think, like I said, when we were sitting there in rooms saying how many people have clients that have pain, and then how many people in here have pain, if we represent the health and fitness industry, we want to make people healthy. And you got to look at every opportunity and every tool that you can have in your toolbox to do that. And I think this is one. It's not the end-all cure-all for everything, but it's a great adjunct for anytime you're putting forces on people's bodies. It's a great adjunct because it also allows you to check your work. If you can test muscles to test one range of motion, wow, they did this exercise and they actually got tighter, you just overloaded something. Or then you can, through manual muscle testing, which is part of the progression, through the jumpstart positional testing, and then MAT, you have the tools to be able to assess, oh, that just broke down. Their tensor fasciolata, their psoas is strong, but the tensor fasciolata got overloaded doing the hip flexion exercise. We need to make that part of the change so that they got more muscles working for them. And so, great tool. Hopefully this brings some good information to you to just open your eyes to what's out there. And so thank you very much for being here. And Rodney, thanks for having me on this webinar.
My pleasure. I'm sure we'll do it again later on down the road. And again, keep your eyes open for the Eleiko Preparation Recovery course. It'll be coming out shortly, and we'll let you know about that. You guys, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Rodney, I have a client walking in 5 minutes too. I'm going to have to hop right off. Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
All right. Thanks a lot. And we'll touch base later today, or I'll reach out to you. Thanks.
Thanks, buddy.